Hello everyone, Nick on Aquamagna here, taking a look at the summer 2015 wave of Bionicle sets. But first, a word about a couple things I know people will get on my case about if I don't get them out of the way right now. Yes, I know the Protectors have names. I think they're okay, but not great. They've grown on me a little, but you see the charm of all the names used in the early years of Bionicle came from the fact that they were derivative of actual languages, and not just silly World of Warcrafty fantasy names that people made up by combining a bunch of random syllables together trying to sound snazzy and mystical but ultimately lacking any meaning. By contrast, if you read enough of Tolkien's works, and hear enough elf names, dwarf names, and orc names, you'd start to notice that each language puts a much bigger emphasis on certain sounds than the other languages do. You start to pick up patterns. Orcish is guttural and harsh, lots of kas and ochs and gas and whatnot. Elvish has lots of soft sounds, thas and ls and os and whatnot. And Dwarvish has a very whimsical, sing-songy sound to it with G's and M's and E sounds. And if you've heard enough of these names, you get a good sense of how the languages work, to a point where if you were to hear a new character's name for the first time without being told what race they were from, you could probably just guess based on how the name sounds. You could hear the name and say, "That sounds like a Dwarvish name," or "That sounds like something an orc mother would belch out." I don't expect LEGO to hire a linguist on the level of Tolkien to come up with the names for the new sets, but still. I didn't have a hard time memorizing all the names used early on in Bionicle G1 because they shared a similar rhythm, carefully picked from a select few languages that were close enough that they create a consistent feel that made it so that as you heard more and more of these names, it was sort of like learning a language. After a while, you'd pick up on certain things, quirks specific to the language that made it stand out and gave you that feel. Unfortunately, as the story went on, they did start making up nonsense names that sounded totally corny and fake and were obviously not a part of any real language. They did get better about it when they introduced Magna, but now I feel they've taken a step backwards. In the first few years, they mostly took words from the Maori language, with a bit of Finnish here and there, and in the last year or so, they gave Magna its own feel by focusing primarily on Latin. Because of this, not only does Magna's language feel internally consistent, it ends up feeling very different than the Matoran language we were used to, and it's not hard to accomplish that. I came up with most of my characters' names just by putting words associated with their element in Google Translate and filtering them through Latin and a bit of Finnish and just a little bit of Maori for old time's sake. And there you go, perfectly serviceable, believable sounding names. Anyway, the point of all this is that right away from the moment I first heard the Protectors' real names, I could just tell that these names were made up. They sound like they could have been taken from a few wildly different languages. They don't share a distinct rhythm that ties them all together as part of one society. They just sound like random sounds, and that makes them less interesting to me. Anyway, I'm still glad these characters are getting names. They just don't feel as real to me as all, and that makes it kind of hard for me to latch onto them. Anyway, now that you know what I think of those, let's talk about the Protector's gender. So, yeah, Korgot is a girl and Kubota is a boy. Neat. I think Korgot works really well as a girl, as crazy as her proportions are. She strikes me as the fun-loving type who gets into mischief when not caught in the thrill of battle. I mean, any character who'll strap a Gatling gun over their stomach knows how to party in my book. As for Kubota, I'll be honest, I wish there could be more than one girl on the team, considering how great he would look as a girl, with his construction being a bit more petite than the Protectors of Jungle and Stone. It makes me wonder if something was changed at the last minute. I still think he works well enough as a tall, skinny man, though, and putting him next to shorter, burlier, beat-you-at-arm wrestling every single time Korgot makes them both look pretty great. Just imagine these two being friends, the dialogue they'd have. This is more than tokenism, this is diversity in body types and whatnot. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's get on to the zombies already. When I first saw leaks of Bionicle 2015 Summer Wave, I'll admit, I was a bit underwhelmed. It felt like the designers had put their best foot forward with the Toast designs and didn't have enough creative juice or budget left over to make this year's villains anywhere near as good. Having these guys in hand, though, my opinion of them has changed drastically, and I think these are some of the niftiest villains we've had since the Baraki. Let's start by going over a few elements they all share. For one thing, the new bone piece, which is literally a completely exposed femur. In terms of visuals, I think this is a pretty great piece, used sparingly and depending on where they're placed. But it's not a piece I want to see overused, and we'll get back to that later. But yeah, when used in conjunction with other elements, this simple piece is extremely effective for conveying what these guys may have looked like when they were alive, how much of their bodies were filled out where flesh has rotted away and armor plating has fallen off. I love the decision to not only make these limb pieces silver, but to release a silver recolor of the backbone piece to create a more consistent look, and more effectively convey that these guys have metal skeletons. Even so, with all the things layered over their empty protodermic frames, these guys are a lot more colorful than you might expect, especially with a new ribcage piece bringing them to life. This piece comes in so many flavors, and the colors make it breathe like some bad juju is flowing through these guys to make them walk again, the other transparent pieces adding to the effect. Each of the 4 smaller skull villains also has smatterings of trans orange as a secondary color to tie them together, and it makes them look a little tainted, like this is the one color that binds them all together, and to the one being whose body is oozing with nothing but this color. The addition of a trans-orange eyepiece, which they also share, completes the effect, as if the leader is able to see through their eyes in the same manner that the Lord of Skull Spiders controls the people possessed by Skull Spiders. And then there's Skull Slicer, whose backstory confuses me. One last touch that really completes the aesthetic is the chest printings. Like the Toa's tribal body paint, these designs are kind of random, but they all share a few traits, such as chains that don't really serve a purpose, but make you wonder if these guys were prisoners of an ancient war or something like that, and you get a good look at their insides, which are probably what the inside of a Toa look like. The point is, the focus on bones and transparent pieces creates a consistent feel between these guys that makes them feel very different next to the Toa. You know how the Toa are so sleek and lean and filled out and complete feeling? These guys are the complete opposite, and it works. They look like if whatever powers animating them were to suddenly fail, they'd fall to pieces as they should. And this is made even stronger by how consistent they are with each other, so much that I'm going to have a tricky time looking at them one by one without repeating myself. Let's start with Skull Warrior. This guy is pretty great. You'd think he'd be the most basic of the bunch, and in some ways he is, but what makes him work as well as he does is that you get so many options with this one package. Out of all the Skull villains, I think he captures the feeling of an undead warrior best, mostly through his asymmetry. The parts that are covered and the parts that are left bare are mismatched and make me wonder what a complete Skull Warrior would look like. Heck, one of his arms is left completely bare from wrist to shoulder. Weirdly, unlike Poato, it's not a swinging arm. He's a little messy, but just solid enough to feel like he's still a threat. His colors also work great. You wouldn't think the trans blue and trans orange pieces would go well together, but because of how they're laid out, they kinda do. The blue parts looking like a slightly more natural color, and the orange parts looking more hellish, especially the emblazoned toes, which I don't think were there when he was alive. There's not much to say about his chest printing. You mostly see pistons and more bones, which I think is in line with Bionicle's whole style. At least it doesn't upset the color scheme much. Then there's his weapons and mask. The mask is one of the best released this year, full of detail, some more mechanical looking. The expression is cold and determined, with the cuts around the mouth making it look enough like a skull to work with the theme. One of my favorite things about this skull-themed mask, and the other we'll be looking at, is the forehead. It's got that same segmented carapace look that the skull spiders have, making me wonder if these things were actually forged from the bodies of spiders or not. If not, it's just another nice detail that ties these guys together visually. This one comes in a darker tone, and it's certainly intimidating. As for the weapons, this guy has a lot of range. There's his bow, which can be held in 2 places just like the Protector of Jungle's weapon. It's basically just a bigger version of that, and if that's all the Skull Warrior came with, I would be a little disappointed. Fortunately, his value is greatly increased with a secondary close-range weapon. Well, I call it that, but when held at the end, this lance reaches super far, and I love the blade itself. It's got all these nicks like it's been used in battle before, but it also looks sort of intentional, like it may have been reforged from the splintered fragments of other swords to have this jagged shape. Either way it works, since while swinging the weapon down, the jagged bits just might hook a mask from behind and rip it off of a Toa's face. While the Skull Warrior's weapons are pretty basic by themselves, together they make him a versatile combatant who looks ready for almost any situation because he simply has more than one way to fight, and more than one way for you to play with him. This, I think, makes him the best army builder set we've ever had. So much so that I almost bought a couple more of him, and I've never felt the urge to do that with any past army builder sets like the Scrawl, but this guy does everything an army builder set should, providing just enough variety not to feel like a waste after that first purchase. While the Skull Warriors all look pretty samey in the cartoon, no one's telling you that you can't build your own Skull Warrior a little differently. With how lopsided and stuck together he is, you can switch the armor and bones around and make him look different, and you can display one Skull Warrior using the bow while the warrior next to him draws his lance. This is something I've loved about Bionicle G2 so far, is how these toys give you so many options, so many ways to play, and as bare bones as he is, I think Skull Warrior is a great example of that. He's an excellent gateway set into this wave. And if you don't plan on getting all of these, I still recommend finding time to squeeze a Skull Warrior in there. He's just great. There are a couple of flaws though. The way the play on his left shin is placed prevents him from being able to crouch as far down with that leg as his other leg, and while the claw toes on his otherwise tiny feet keep him stable enough that he won't fall forward, he's still top-heavy enough that the lack of heel support makes it really easy to fall on his back. Thankfully, his weapons are heavy enough that holding at least one of them should keep him balanced even with the other mounted on his back. Next, let's move on to Skull Slicer. For the most part, this guy's construction is pretty straightforward, shall we say. Yeah, when people complain about CCBS being too simplistic and whatnot, this is kind of what they're talking about. I will let Skull Slicer get away with it this one time though, because honestly I think covering up with more armor and bulking up his limbs might ruin the aesthetic he's going for. I like to put these guys on a scale of sorts. Skull Basher, the next guy we'll be looking at, is on one end. He has a good amount of armor plating for a walking skeleton. And then there's Skull Warrior, who, while not as heavily armored or as clean, still has enough to fall in the middle of this scale. Skull Basher is the heavy one, Skull Warrior is the medium one, while Skull Slicer is his own extreme. He has barely any armor, which I find quite unnerving to look at. At least with most zombies, even if you see exposed bones, there's usually still some meat clinging to them. All this guy's meat is gone though. There's nothing holding him together. I think he conveys the whole skelly man feel the most intensely out of the whole bunch. There's a few other things that add to his creep factor, mainly the extra pair of arms that you may have noticed. You might want to get those looked at. Another thing that adds to his look is a skull spider mask. Now, I'm not going to get into its story significance here, but I can appreciate its use set-wise. Personally, I like this for a couple of reasons. One is that we only get 2 new masks from these guys, and while I would have liked for there to be more new mask molds, if I had to choose between 3 of these guys wearing the same mask, or one of them wearing this, I'll choose this. When you display these guys as a group, having a 3rd mask type in there goes a long way to diversify them and break up the crowd nicely. Also, as I said earlier, it's not like this one stands out that much thanks to its traits that it shares with the others, making it fit in well enough. Plus, that's just how alien it looks, with that evil, swollen forehead. Combine this with the extra arms, and this guy is freaky. Like, really, the mask and arms work together surprisingly well, better than they would if they were apart. If you replace this with either of the other 2 masks, he just looks less special. I don't think LEGO was being lazy when they gave Skull Slicer this mask. I think they were being smart at making the most of what they had, and it really seals the deal on that whole creep factor. Plus, just look at those colors. When I look at this guy and I try to imagine him moving, I see him shambling around and being all jittery like those stop-motion skeletons from Jason and the Argonauts. The others have a little too much bulk on them to have that feel. They're more like traditional zombies, but I don't mind getting one guy who looks like this. He stands out so much without having to do anything. But he does do something with his gear function, and it's something. When I saw photos of this guy months ago, I was excited by the prospect of a figure who could move all 4 of his arms at once. And he does, but it's kind of underwhelming. As these gears are arranged, turning the knob makes 3 of his arms swing up or down at once, while his other arm will swing the other way. And this has to be the most confusing design choice I've seen all year. See, I could understand if the one arm that went the other way was holding this claw weapon. It's made to yank off a Toa's mask, and it would make sense for him to slash down with his 3 sword-swinging arms at the same time as he demasks his opponent. He would finish them off in like a second, one swift motion. But nope, this motion is complicated by making his claw arm move with 2 of the swords, while the 3rd one swings away. I don't get this at all. It feels so unnecessary. We'll get back to this in a minute though. Like I said, the claw is used for pulling masks off of other figures' faces, or at least that's what it's supposed to do. Turns out these masks stay on better than people say, or maybe the claw's grip is just really weak. Well, I don't think I can say that since it's apparently strong enough to pull down an entire figure. These masks just don't want to come off. Okay, so personally, I don't really care for this gimmick much. Yeah, it's cool seeing him swing several arms at once, but not nearly as cool as it would be if the blades would swing down simultaneously. And the claw is a neat idea, but I'd rather this guy have each arm swing its own way, like this. Look at this beautiful chaos. Yeah, it's kinda hard keeping the blades from banging together, but this is kind of what I was always hoping Skull Slicer would be like. And another note, I like his chest printing. It goes with this haphazard clockwork nature, the gears and whatnot. Bottom line, Skull Slicer is a good figure, he really is. I appreciate all the little touches they threw in to make him work, from his mask of choice all the way down to his extended heels. Even the way the trans-orange claw kinda matches that one trans-orange plate on his other side. But in almost every angle I look at him from, both literally and metaphorically, he's missing something. At the very least, with all the bones, weaponry, and trans pieces, he makes a decent parts pack, but I wish they did something more with him. Which I know must sound kinda bonkers, seeing how they try to do a little of everything with him. But he ends up not being able to do any particular thing especially well. Anyway, cool figure, but not the best this wave has to offer. Next figure, please. Skull Basher is one of the better villains released this year. He has a clean look and a shape that gives him a sense of dignity and purpose, like even in death he knows who he is. He's a little plain, but he looks solid and cohesive because of it. Even as bony as he is, and as short as he is, he still looks powerful because of his proportions. His bulk is accentuated in just the right areas. The shoulders flow well with the body, and the hoof-like feet combined with the shin armor give him a good foundation. If I had to guess by his giant horns, he's some kind of undead minotaur-like creature. The second new mask that we get with this wave works great for this kind of character. It looks a little more wild than Skull Warrior's mask, yet it still keeps it together a little better than Skull Slicer's mask. As for this color scheme, I would have liked to see a little more purple, maybe some trans-purple armor plates, but I guess the budget ran out for this year. As it is, there were only 3 trans-purple pieces on this entire set, 2 of them almost completely covered up, and the solid purple pieces go with them well enough, but still, I don't feel there's enough of either not to break up Basher's otherwise very cohesive look, and the chest printing, while still very nice and solid like the rest of him, does little to help in the color department. As such, Basher has the least emphasis on his signature color. There's enough of it, but only barely, and I do wish there was a little more. Now let's talk about his weapons and his function, cause it's pretty great. These axe blade pieces are much broader than the swords, but not quite as heavy as I thought they'd be, since many parts are left empty, so there's less plastic. There's still enough plastic that it looks good from the side, and I like the stylized shape of it. It looks a lot cleaner than the Warrior and Slicer's swords, but can still be used to pry a mask off with the hooked ends of the blade itself depending on how you use it. Because it's so wide though, it can be used to smack an enemy with a side of it, and that's where his function comes in. Instead of the usual gearbox harness with its turning knobs and whatnot, the designers created an entirely new function just for him that feels like something straight out of the days of the Rahi. By pushing this button, you slam his arms together, closing in from the sides instead of swinging up or down as figures with gears do. It's a good surprise attack that I can see knocking any Toa senseless. It's also flexible enough that this doesn't have to be the only way Skull Basher bashes his foes. There's enough give that you can also wiggle the button from side to side, enabling him to swing his arms back and forth one at a time. Whether this was intentional or it just worked out that way, it does give you another play option and also makes his figure feel a little more alive. He's not like some big bug that's evolved to have one neat trick that works most of the time but can't do anything else should that one trick fail. He feels more like a man, more flexible and adaptive, able to keep swinging and fighting even if his special trick does fail him the first time. When not using this function, his arms do get pulled pretty far back as a result, but I don't mind since it does make him look bigger, like he's puffing out his chest in an attempt to intimidate foes. The one true negative I will say this figure has is the horns. I do like the idea, and I can live with the color, but it's way too easy to hit them while using his gimmick, and because they're attached to his brainstalk, smacking them from below makes the brainstalk go down, flinging his mask up, making him probably the easiest figure for a Toa to demask. You have to place his arms just right to avoid Basher hitting himself this way, but it's not hard to do that. Aside from this admittedly pretty huge flaw, Basher is a great set. He's imposing for his size, he's clean and cohesive, probably the most streamlined of all the villains despite everything he has going on, and he has a fun innovative function that I hope to see reused someday, maybe even for a winged figure to be able to flap their wings or something like that. It even gives him a more expressive range of posability. If you can only afford one of the smaller villain wave sets, it may as well be this one. Overall, Basher, Slicer, and Warrior are pretty good, and for all their faults, they look great together. They are ruthless. Having them in hand, I'm kind of wowed by just how different each figure manages to be despite using many of the same pieces. Their cooler colors and shared elements make them similar enough that they're all clearly a part of the same gang, yet gangly Slicer, bulky Basher, and patchwork Warrior, while sharing the same general aesthetic, each have their own individually created aesthetics and make each figure great in a different way for different reasons. But none of them are quite as big a departure from each other as this guy is. Okay, I kid. I actually really like Skull Scorpio. He's much better than I thought he was gonna be. In some respects, anyway. How good he is to you depends on what you want him to be. In terms of simple aesthetics, if he's trying to look like a scorpion, he fails pretty hard. So for a while, I kind of assumed that he wasn't a scorpion. I look at his bizarre patchwork design and get a 9 vibe, like he's one of those monsters in that movie that were just loosely cobbled together junk made to look as creepy as possible as some form of psycho warfare. I figured that after raising Slicer, Basher, and all the warriors from the dead, Coulter was running out of parts and didn't have enough to make any more humanoid soldiers, but was able to work with what he had and just threw a bunch of leftover body parts together into a shape they were never made to be arranged in. Slap this giant contraption onto his back, and there you have it, he's a scorpion now. I think if this were Skull Scorpio's backstory, he'd come together splendidly, becoming the creepiest member of the bunch by far. I mean, just look at him. From above, you could say that the tail joins where there used to be knees, and his head has been turned backwards. Good lord. Unfortunately, that's not his backstory at all. Yeah, it turns out Scorpios are just weird giant scorpions with weird humanoid faces and snapping tails. I do still think he can get away with most of this look if we just chalk this out to him being an alien scorpion that doesn't have to look like the ones we have on Earth, and to that end, I think the idea of claws with extra digits and the tail itself being a giant claw is pretty darn creative, but its overly mechanical appearance doesn't quite match the rest of him. All of that said, I think his biggest strength in terms of his looks is his color scheme. The bright neon green does a great job conveying that this is a toxic, deadly creature you want to avoid, kind of like those colorful frogs who ward off predators with poisonous slime that oozes out of their skin. It also sort of reminds me of the brightly colored blue Nui Jaga from way back when. I like that they thought to add little bits of green to his tail with the Borak eyes, just enough to create some desperately needed consistency between the tail and the body, and the trans-orange parts create a great contrast between the two colors. Leave those out, and he may look just a tad bland, but the colors are mixed just right to make him pop. His mask is the more wild-looking of the two new molds, and as with Bashir, I think it suits him much better than the more humanoid, less organic-looking skull mask. Alright, so we've talked a lot about his design, let's talk about his functions. I like the claws themselves. They're unusual, but that's precisely why I like them. These guys are aliens to us. They shouldn't be restricted by some need to look like normal animals. The orange thumbs each being able to go their own way makes them more expressive, I think. I think the arms are just long enough to fit the rest of the body, and this is where most of his articulation is. Aside from neck articulation and the ability to move his tail up and down and left and right a little bit, he doesn't have much at all. These legs are firmly locked in place. They provide a very good base, easily able to support this otherwise pretty lopsided figure, but they don't do anything. At least with the Lord of Skull Spiders, each leg had a foot on the end that you could move around, and the legs themselves could all move with that cool grabby motion. At least they did something. Skull Scorpio's legs have no functionality whatsoever. They're just there to hold up the figure, and that's it. The build is pretty basic too, just a few beams and pins and whatnot holding everything together. So yeah, for the most part, he's a brick. I've seen people change the legs up, not only improving his articulation, but his colors, and everything about him. And yeah, if this guy came with all those femurs and neon bones, I'd recommend him in a heartbeat, at least as a great parts pack. Let's look at his tail though, because what good is a toy scorpion if the tail doesn't move? Thankfully it does, and as awkward as it looks, the function is pretty great. You pull down on this trigger, and through a surprisingly flexible series of attachments, the sides of the tail slam together hard. While Skull Scorpio is short in stature, the idea is to be able to reach to his face with the tail and knock the mask clean off. Like Slicer's gimmick, it doesn't always work. It's still a cool, ferocious looking attack that's fun to pull off and feels damaging though. All in all, Skull Scorpio isn't that great. He looks awkward, he feels awkward, and while the tail is fun, I wouldn't call it a saving grace. This guy does exactly what I said Bashir avoided earlier. He's literally a bug who has one neat trick and can't do anything else. His posability is incredibly limited, a result of him being built completely around a gimmick. And it's a good gimmick, but it's attached to a figure that's just kinda so-so and doesn't really do anything. Yet I can't bring myself to say that I hate him. I do like how he looks with the other Skull villains. He has some variety and stands out among the crowd, and comparing him to the Lord of Skull Spiders, a fight between these two looks like it could go either way. He's also surprisingly big. He's not bad per se, none of these figures are, but one of them has to be the worst. It was always going to be someone, and so that position falls upon Skull Scorpio. Let me make this clear. 2015 has been a pretty solid year in terms of Bionicle sets. I'd even say it's been great. I think all of the other figures, including Lord of Skull Spiders, do their job and don't sacrifice too much just to pull off some crazy gimmick. At least in the case of Lost, his body is the gimmick, it's an important part of him. Skull Scorpio throws that compromise as defined 2015 out the window. His body just sorta hangs off of the tail. The tail is the real feature here, the rest of him is useless. He has one neat trick, and that's it. I like his color scheme, and I've seen people make a few changes that seem like they should have been perfectly doable for LEGO that really could have saved this figure. As he is, though, he's just okay. Not bad, but hardly remarkable. However, because both of this year's waves are populated with figures that are so much better in every way, I hereby declare Skull Scorpio
the worst Bionicle set of 2015.
Lost, looks like you're in the clear. Something I've left out up to this point are the collectibles. These guys don't come with skull spiders, but they do come with masks. They're basically just the same gold mask that came with the Winterwave Toa, but now they have transparent elements blended in and look even cooler. The idea is that they're being stolen and corrupted by the Skull villain with a corresponding color, but they match the Toa's colors too. To be honest, I don't think any of the Skull villains wear these masks well. I mean, that's the idea. These masks don't belong to them. Of course they don't look right. But it's a good play feature. I mean, it's there. On the Toa, Platu's looks okay. Anua's mask looks pretty good. Leiwa's is questionable since he doesn't have any other transgreen elements to go with it. Kopaka's looks way better though. In fact, I think this could pass as perfectly normal for him. Heck, his corrupted golden mask looks better on him than his uncorrupted golden mask, thanks to the trans blue part breaking up what would have been too much gold in one place. Unfortunately, this is all we get. There was no 6th Skull villain with an aquatic theme and filled with darker trans blue pieces, so we don't get a corrupted galley mask, and the final Stellar Wave has a lot of trans orange pieces, as we'll see in a minute, but it doesn't come with a corrupted Tahu mask. It's a shame because I'm sure either would have looked great, and having all 6 corrupted masks together would have been great for display, even if it's just at the Skull villain's feet. Now though, we get to the real meat of this wave, with what just might be the perfect set to cap off this year. Akimu the Mask Maker versus Kulta the Skull Grinder. Let's look at Skull Grinder first. I think out of all the Skull villains, Kulta looks the best, or at least the most cohesive. His color scheme is incredibly simple and focused. The trans orange throughout his body flows together really well, and the lack of a secondary transparent color cluttering things up makes it pretty clear that this guy is the one in charge. It's his fiery essence flowing through his gang. It connects them to him. The gunmetal armor layered over silvery bones works especially well here, topped off with just a bit of black in his feet and horns. The silver mask goes well enough with the darker parts, but is still bright enough, with just a bit of extra contrast created by the horns, to draw your attention to it and not just blend in with the rest of it. The horns themselves feel a little more justified than Skull Bashers. They're shorter and less likely to be hit from below by a Toa, or himself, so defeating him this way does end up feeling a little more like a genuine victory, and they just look great. They're just the right size to look menacing without getting in the way of anything. Then there's his chest printing, my favorite of this wave by far. Not only does it blend in perfectly with his color scheme overall, it shows just the right mix of clockwork, bony parts, and evil voodoo magic to perfectly convey what these guys are all about. He looks like some otherworldly fire is raging inside him, burning anyone who comes close to him. Kind of the feel I wanted the Protector of Fire to have, only, you know, evil. Skull Grinder is also the largest villain set, his mask looking all the more menacing on top of his very large body. The rib cage is raised just a bit and juts out from the front further than the other villains, and some may be bothered by the gappiness it creates, but I think this works out well for most angles, since, while I would like it if the ribs could close around or connect to something on the sides and look less gappy, the way it protrudes away from the spine does mimic a real rib cage a bit better than those of the other Skull villains, I find. The gearbox is beefed up with a very clever use of whatever these are. Looking at the extra girth they add to him and imagining what empty areas there are being filled with muscle makes him feel like he was a total bruiser when he was alive. Then we get to his legs, which aren't nearly as impressive. I get the feeling they wanted this guy to be really top-heavy, the legs sort of helping to emphasize that. Intentional or not, it can't really be helped. Aside from the addition of friction joints to the ankles, this is about as long as these legs can get without the shins being way too long compared to the thighs. For aesthetic consistency, they had to put the femur pieces somewhere, and it's too bad that they only come in this size. As he is, Kulta stands at about the same height as Tahu. Tahu had very long legs and a fairly average body. Kulta has sorta long legs and a very big body. If only his legs were at least as long as Tahu's, he'd stand a bit taller than him, and look all the more fearsome for it. Like I said though, he's about the same size as the tallest Toa, so he'd make a good adversary for any of them. He comes off as that kind of baddie whose power is on the same level as the hero's, so you can imagine the battle going either way. Looking at the animations though, it seems LEGO wants us to believe that Kulta is much more powerful than a Toa, and much taller, and as it stands, I don't see it. I think he makes a good opponent, a good rival, maybe, but that's it. Anyway, I find Skull Grinder to be one of the better looking figures released this summer, if not one of the best. He has a little of everything that makes them work, and I think he captures that bony voodoo witch doctor feel better than the actual witch doctor set overall. Bottom line, it's hard to oversell this guy. He doesn't come off quite as intimidating as, say, the General Grievous figure, and I wish LEGO had enough faith in Bionicle's appeal to give us a proper Titan-sized figure like this for the line. But he does have a pretty commanding presence standing among the other Skull villains. It's clear that he's the boss, and if any of the others were to try to usurp his authority, they would fail. He just looks good, and to think, the best is still yet to come. Anyway, moving forward, let's talk about his weapons. In his right hand he carries a massive staff that uses 3 of the broad blade pieces. It looks both majestic and brutal. I really like how what could have been a giant blob of silver is broken up by trans-orange highlights and even that unnecessary but still appreciated red spike at the other end. It fits the colors of his body. It really feels like it belongs to him. In his other hands, he wields one of the narrower blade pieces, which looks nice and balances him out a bit. It looks like it'd be the first thing he'd use to attack or defend himself, only resorting to the staff for the finishing blow against an especially powerful opponent worth his time. But in all honesty, I'll probably just give this one to Skull Slicer. Going back to his main weapon, it actually does something. Sort of. A bit more conventional than some of the other Skull villains, Kulta does have a gearbox, and it moves both of his arms. Unfortunately, it doesn't hold up the staff very well. Yeah, it's just a tad too heavy for him. It's a shame LEGO didn't include an extra couple of gears. Simply putting more into his size to fix this problem is such an easy fix it baffles me that they didn't think to do this themselves, especially since they gave Akimu gears to spare. We shouldn't have to fix their oversights for them. Adding a small extra gear or 3, and Kulta could hold up this massive staff much better. At this point, the joints themselves are more likely to give out than the gears. Otherwise, he has no problem. So why can't LEGO make him this way? He would have been basically perfect then. So anyway, what is Kulta's spin on this gimmick? What does he add with his weapon? I'll let this guy demonstrate.
Dun-dun. Dun-dun. Dun-dun, 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 dun-dun. Oh no, Mr. Bill! Oh no! Oh no!
I can't believe I didn't even consider that the staff could be used this way, but yep, turns out it works. The 3 hooks are really good for ripping masks off of their faces, and the staff is just so big you can use it to pummel them afterward. See, this is the kind of extra gimmick that I really like. Nothing was sacrificed to make it happen. It doesn't only work sometimes, like Slicer's grabby claw thing, and it's non-intrusive. It just worked out that way because the pieces they had to work with were just that well designed. True, actually positioning him to do this takes some work, but it's worth it to see it happening. All in all, Kulta is one of the best figures of this entire wave. He looks good, he plays well, and he can stand up to any Toa released this year. The only negatives I find are his proportions being slightly awkward and the lack of support for his main weapon from the gears. So in light of this, no, I don't think Kulta is the best figure of the summer wave. Oh sure, he's part of the best set, but the other part of that set is even better in my book. Behold, Akimu. This figure looks amazing. The color scheme is perfect. The gold, silver, and trans blue methodically spaced out in just the right ways. His proportions are great, and his build comes off as very powerful for his size. The weapons are lovely, the shield being the best use of that swirly wheel piece I have ever seen, and the hammer being just right for a figure this size and managing to squeeze a 6-barreled stud shooter in there without it looking less like a hammer. The shoulder armor left over from Chima's figures gives him a feeling of authority, and combined with the weapons, the girth, and the colors, he looks like such an important character. He feels like this indomitable warrior dwarf king, exactly as he should. This guy isn't Manui, he's not a god, he's just a particularly powerful member of the Protector species. He's the king of the islanders, and I think they've pulled this off stupendously. I mean, I knew I was gonna like him, but I wasn't expecting to love him as much as I do. He's just too darn fun. He's a joy to put together and to play with. The only things that bother me are that one red pin in his head, which unfortunately is just LEGO standard lately, so I guess I can't really count that, and the legs that are built the same way as Narmoto's were and have the same problem. However, it's not nearly as much of a problem since Akimu's arms feel more like, well, arms than his did, so he feels more complete. And his proportions are otherwise so compact that switching them out for even slightly longer thighs makes him feel oddly lanky, and it still works, but it's just fine as is, really. I'm perfectly willing to forgive it in this case. He's intuitive to pose and easy to balance, having all the joints that could be crammed into a Protector-sized figure, and he feels mighty and awesome, like someone you'd want to get behind even if you were a Toa. He looks good leading the villagers, he looks good leading the Toa. Yes, he looks like he could take on a Skull Warrior, Basher, what have you, all by himself. Even if he ends up not being that strong in the animations, he's still amazing as a toy. I'm gonna say it. For what's essentially a Protector with a gearbox, I think Akimu is the best figure of the year. He does so many things right. There's so little to not like about him. I would have been fine buying this guy by himself. And even if I didn't like Kulta much, I'd still buy the 2-pack and be happy to have this little wonder. But now let's see what these two look like together. The two figures have a great David and Goliath thing going on, and their colors complement each other extremely well. Kulta's reds and darker, more metallic colors against Akimu's blue and gold feel like they were meant to be. Kulta looks like he represents everything Akimu isn't, and vice versa. Face them off against each other, and even if you have no idea who these guys are, they're so well designed and look so good together that it's clear who you're rooting for and it becomes a stuff of legends, and I feel this one set elevates Bionicle G2 to a new level, at least in terms of character and set design. One last collectible you get with these guys is this year's all-important Mask of Creation. The mask itself is one of the most intricately detailed masks LEGO has ever made. The shape of the eyes is neutral enough that it can just as easily become benevolent or menacing depending on who's wearing it. The ridges on the top make it fit for a king, and they just barely manage not to look overdone. There are runes all over the mask in Akoto's language. I don't know if they mean anything or not, but it has that always needed on some level feel of mysticism and culture that I love to see injected into Bionicle. Chocked to the brim with great lines, shapes, and textures, it's hard to say whether or not it's my favorite mask of 2015 or not. I can't help but acknowledge its beauty, even though I have no real attachment to it like I do with the likes of Tahoe and Kopaka, whose masks have been beautifully reimagined for this new line. It's a very well crafted mask, a feat all by itself, but that's all I really have to say about it. It's just a really splendidly made mask. Originally meant to be worn by Akimu, it fits on Kulta just fine, horns and all. This feels so wrong in a way that feels so right, like the second phase of a 3-part final boss fight. But then you put on Akimu himself, and wow, now he looks like a king. As weird as it sounds though, personally I find him a little more endearing with a Golden Protector mask. I just find it flows better with the rest of his look because of the trans blue parts and the simpler look. And this mask is so detailed, so packed with it, that it ends up not really matching the rest of him. This is why I feel a little conflicted about this mask, because it's not just a mask. It doesn't look like it can really belong to any one being, more like they're just lucky to have the privilege to wear it. It feels on par with the Mask of Life from the old series, like it has a mind of its own and chooses whose face to rest on or whatever. Akimu still looks great with it, and mightier than ever, but let's just say this mask is something else. Mask Maker vs. Skull Grinder is a great set, the best of 2015 I'd say. You get two great figures, the coolest mask of the year, and the synergy this creates makes these things even better together than if they were sold separately. Before I move on to my final thoughts, let's be sure not to leave out the 6th member of 2015's villain sets, because yes, there is one. He's the Lord of Skull Spiders. Yeah, I could see right from the beginning that we were just getting one of this year's villains super early with this guy. So how does he stand with the Skull villains? Standing with the likes of Slicer, Basher, and even Scorpio, Loss's presence feels a bit odd. His look differs from theirs greatly, mainly because they're all clearly undead, while Loss is quite clearly alive. Surrounded by the Skull villains, he looks like they're about to pull his legs off. I will say he looks good standing next to Skull Grinder. The colors are close enough that they look like they're part of the same team, like they both serve Makuta. It works, even if you want to pretend Loss is just Kulta's pet or something. Surprisingly though, I think the two look like equals. Loss isn't as tiny as people make him out to be, he's just a low rider. I can see these two having quite intellectual conversations together. While he may not fit in with the rest of the gang very well, if you already collected a fair number of Winter Wave sets, you should have a modest army of Skull Spiders ready to mix in with the villain wave, the Skull villains themselves becoming a sturdy backbone for this army. Oh yeah, this is beautiful. I was surprised by just how well Lord of Skull Spiders and his underlings really complete the wave. The Skull Spiders may not look that intimidating on their own, and the Skull villains, while enough of a threat, feel more like an obstacle than anything else. But join these forces together, and they look like a force to be reckoned with, not only increasing their value, but also the value of the Toe and Protector sets. I love this. The more of these guys you get, the better they are, and the more value each subsequent buy has. As of this video, I have purchased one of every single Bionicle figure released this year, and I don't regret spending a cent on any of them, not even Skull Scorpio. And on one last note, the box set is pretty great too, setting up a sort of storyline by showing different parts of the ancient city, taking us closer and closer to the Forge for the climactic final battle between the two stars of this wave, all the while showing those same two moons we've seen in the sky of the Toe and Protector's box art. So yeah, good stuff. Bionicle's Summer Wave gets my seal of approval. Skull Basher, Slicer, and Warrior are all good sets. Scorpio's just sorta there, but I wouldn't call him bad. The 2-pack is the best set of the year, and if you don't have that much money to spend and can only afford a couple of these, I would definitely recommend this set. If you can only get one, make it this one. And if you can only afford one of the smaller sets, I'd recommend Basher first. Otherwise Warrior, then Slicer, and Yeah, that's it. What really saves this wave though is the new look they've managed to pull off. These guys had something to prove. Not only that they could stand out from the villain waves of Bionicle's past, but that they weren't just dumbed down Toa sets. It was an uphill battle from the moment they were leaked. The new bones, rib cages, masks, armor add-ons, weapons, and a huge focus on transparent elements all gel together to create a strong new aesthetic, a distinct new feel that doesn't resemble a Toa or a run-of-the-mill Hero Factory set at all, and they own it. These sets are so consistent with each other and so visually unlike anything we've ever gotten that they work. Whatever the designers were trying to do with the Skull villains, they did it. They've succeeded. The Skull villains aren't amazing sets, but they are good sets, and a worthy first wave of villains to kick the new storyline into gear. They're bold and unique, introducing new builds and gimmicks that, while in some cases a little finicky, still get an A for effort. Well, maybe an A-. That said, I admit that these sets did have me a little worried, because the introduction of the new bones has simplified the building just a little bit, and I was worried that it might be a sign of things to come, that LEGO would start producing more molds like this and use them in future sets, including Toa, moving their focus to a more Ben 10 building experience. And I would hate to see that. Like I said before, when people complain about CCBS being simple, this is what they're talking about. They think it's all this. Thankfully, that doesn't seem to be the case. I've seen the leaks, I know what next year's sets look like, and I don't see any of these bones on them. This makes me happy, because it shows that the designers still know what they're doing. They gave us these pieces to give us more possibilities for creature and character designs. If you want to make a spooky undead character, go ahead. The pieces are there now. You can do it. All LEGO has done with these new elements is expand the range of different looks you can go for. The skulls haven't taken over or anything, and we're not going to see these elements overused from the looks of it. This makes the skull villains special, I feel, and while not as endearing as, say, the Paraka or as timelessly menacing as the Rakshi, I'd say these guys are pretty memorable nonetheless. They did what they could and introduced an impressive range of builds and looks with but a few new elements used sensibly, and for that, I think they're pretty swell. Now I just wish these bones were made in a second size for larger figures like Skull Grinder. I do think most of these figures look just a tad small next to some of the Toa, but they're still pretty threatening by the very nature of their being. They have some neat tricks, a unique look, and they really add something to this year that I think completes it well. Oh, and of course there's Akimu, the best figure of 2015 despite his size. I stand by that. Bionicle 2015 has been a great year, at least in terms of sets. Story-wise, it's just kinda so-so, but I really don't understand the people who get so worked up and continue to decry the new line like they'd be so much happier if only Bionicle could stay dead and buried and they didn't have to live in a world where they had to see it bastardized this way. I'm not getting on a soapbox like I did last time, at least not for nearly as long. I've already made my big statement in defense of CCBS, but that isn't enough for some people. I think there are always going to be some who look at CCBS and think, oh, you just snap it together, boom, nothing special about it, and will go so far as to say that anything that incorporates CCBS elements instantly becomes junk. Like you could make a great mock using mostly old school Bionicle pieces, and as soon as you find a place where a CCBS plate would fill out some empty space, oh no, you done goofed, you ruined it, it's invalid now, all because you used the wrong pieces. It is Hero Factory parts, so it's bad. What were you thinking? There are no wrong pieces. LEGO is all about taking things that by themselves aren't that remarkable and accomplishing remarkable things with them by combining them with each other, sometimes very different elements, which is exactly what they've done here, by combining CCBS with Technic. I'm sure there were people who resisted the first Technic sets back when they were new, and I'm sure there were people who got used to those, but resisted the new Technic beams that didn't have studs on the sides and couldn't connect to bricks that way when those were released. Just like there were those who resisted the Slizers and Toa when they were new because they were dumbing LEGO down and making kids stupid. And yet, I don't see anyone accusing the Toa Mata of being Throwbots in disguise because they use Throwbot parts. I love how the new Bionicle sets use this system to create characters, while also making great toys with the integration of Technic engineering. CCBS is just the dressing. Heck, I'd say the gearboxes we've gotten this year are better than any we got in G1, and it bugs me that people brush it off as just one new piece, as if the Toa Mata were ever anything more than that. I love Bionicle. I was there in 2001. It was my childhood. I was obsessed with it. Everything about it. I drew the Toa hundreds of times, and it drove people nuts because to them, they all look the same. The story still resonates with me to this day. I have Tahu Nuva on my shelf. I have all the Toa Metru, my favorite wave from G1. I replaced all the red axles on Takanuva with black ones so he'd look better. I have the Mount Nui online game downloaded on my laptop so I can replay it anytime I want. I did a 3.5-hour LP of it a couple years ago. I made a big review of most of the old Bionicle games. I still have the movies, I still have some of the comics, I have a drawer under my bed full of spare Bionicle and Technic pieces like any good Bionicle fan. Heck, since I did that LP, I've been working on a fanfiction called Nova Orbis, which picks up years after the original story to show what eventually becomes of the Matoran race, because I couldn't let the old universe die, and even as old characters like Mako and Tepo and Kopikas Taraga, and I'm gonna keep working on it for years to come, if I can, because I have the whole story planned out in my head, and if Bionicle G2 does end in 2017, my story will outlive it as well, continuing for years. Make no mistake, I haven't forgotten what always made Bionicle great. That isn't why I'm able to enjoy these new sets. Nobody made me forget. Nobody tricked me into buying these or wasting my money. I wasn't influenced into doing it. LEGO didn't fool me into liking these products. And I wouldn't say that I'm so desperate to have something with Bionicle set on the box that I would rather accept crap than have nothing at all. Because these sets aren't crap. They're just good. Even if I hated the new story, which I don't, I would still buy at least some of these because they're just great toys, and they managed to recapture what drew me to the original toys way back when. I remember seeing those images of Tahu and Anua in the back of those instruction booklets that came with the Technic sets of the time, like C-3PO and so on. I didn't know anything about Bionicle's story at the time. I didn't even know Gali was a girl when she was the first Toa set I got, not until I heard the narrator call her she on the CD that she came with. And despite being so different, despite changing so much with the times, these figures have given me the same rush that the Toa of old did as I built them in 2001. You know, when I first saw the new sets appear on store shelves, I grabbed them and rushed to get back home and start building. I was so excited that I didn't stop to think about how much that really means. Recently though, I went to Toys R Us again and looked at the sets on the shelves, the displays with Tahu, Narmoto, Kalta, Akimu, the lights, the turntables, all that, and it finally truly sunk in that Bionicle was back. Really back. Maybe his presence won't mean as much to the kids of today as it did to us because they're just too different, I don't know. But it feels so good to see my old heroes proudly standing on the shelves where they belong again. It takes me back to seeing the old figures on display in that very same Toys R Us, and even being allowed to play with them a little bit in the store in 2001. I hear the movie themes ringing in my head, I see the Manui online game, I see them. It's like they never left. I don't know how many of you guys can relate, but bottom line, Bionicle G2 isn't going to be for everybody. For one reason or another, some people are always going to be turned off by it. And they'll say it's a matter of principle. They'll glorify their butthurt with flowery words like betrayal and honoring what Bionicle was, looking down on anybody who buys these. And I have more to say about this, but I'll save it for next time, when the next wave comes out. For now, I hope that maybe I'll have convinced a few to take one more look at these sets with these videos. Call it a matter of principle, or some vague thing like that. Look down on people like me for betraying everything Bionicle stands for, whatever that means. Call the children who want these and the parents who buy them stupid and say they have Down syndrome, if you really must be so awful. Make it out like they just made some huge mistake to look back on and regret years down the road. But that isn't up for you to decide. You don't get to decide what people shouldn't like. There's nothing to save people from. Bionicle is back. It's here for a little while. Let us have it. Good day. And that's it for this year, at least in terms of Bionicle. Next time, well, there don't seem to be any new major Sonic releases on the horizon, so I'm going to re-review the Sonic Adventure games. And as for next year, I've seen the leaks, and from the looks of it, the next wave of Bionicle sets will give me plenty to talk about. Toodles!